that was my headspace, was that it was a binary, that either she was gonna be fine and everything was fine and they were just totally wrong, or this was something that I absolutely could not deal with.
Hi, you're listening to The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney, and I am super excited to share with you the story of Anna. Anna is almost 3 years old and has achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism. Anna and I have something pretty cool in common. Our moms are both named Katherine. In this episode, Katherine and I share about what it was like to find out her unborn child had achondroplasia. She shares how inadequate she felt to be Anna's mother after learning about her diagnosis, to the point of feeling she would be better off if adopted by adults who also had dwarfism, and how that has evolved as she found her place as her advocate and had a life changing conversation with an adult woman with the same diagnosis. A little about Katherine and her appearance on this show. As I was planning the episodes for this season, I had written in an interview with an adult sibling of someone with disabilities to get their perspective and to give us advice as parents. Well, as I filled in other episodes, this one kind of got pushed out of the way and I forgot about it because there are so many great topics to cover with this theme. Time went on, and several guests had to cancel, and I found myself with an opening, which was actually pretty stressful for my ultra structured self. Within a few days of that, I received a message from Katherine telling me that she would like to share her story on the show about her daughter Anna, but also about her upbringing with her brother Jonathan with medical complexities. She told me she had so much to share about that experience and the things she does in her own family to make it a better experience for her older son, Sam, in the way she wished her upbringing had been. Well, obviously, this was fate. I took it as a wonderful sign from the universe and scheduled. Her brother comes up a few times in this episode, but in her special topic episode next week, she gives us the DL when it comes to supporting healthy slash typical siblings. It is solid gold. I'm so grateful for her willingness to share both about her role as a mother and as a sister in this realm. Katherine and her husband Randy live in Minneapolis with their two children, Sam, who is 4, and of course Anna, who is almost 3. She is an associate professor of engineering and a lover of books and being outside. Let's get to it. Hi, Katherine. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Madeline. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I am super excited to chat about Anna and your family and kind of your evolution in being her mother. And I would love for you to start out by just telling us a little bit about Anna and who she is and kind of what her struggles are.
Anna is so great. First of all, she
Mm.
is just sweet, empathetic, thoughtful little girl, and she brings so much joy. I was thinking the story I wanted to tell about her that kind of sums it up is I was carrying her in a backpack, and my husband was walking beside us, and she looked over at him and she just said, "Love," and she wanted him to give her love.
Oh.
And so, of course, he reaches over and then he had to like hold her hand in the backpack at a really awkward angle for like a quarter mile before she would let go. And ever since that, like that's her word. And she'll just, she'll just come up to you and ask for love. If you even think about getting upset with her about something, she'll be like, "Love," and then you can't be angry. And but she's kind of a diva in her own way, but she is just pure love. So
Mm.
she's also extremely adorable. I know I'm like very biased because I'm her mom, but she has achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism, which is maybe the most familiar to people, the physical characteristics. But what it basically translates into is short arms and short legs and a large head. And so, she's 2.5 and she's basically all head. And then
Mm.
she's all eyes. She has these amazing blue eyes.
Mm.
And she cannot be resisted.
Mm.
She's absolutely the cutest person alive.
Ah, I love that so much. I'm like, man, Anna and Kimball could be buddies. I wish we lived closer because
I
I could
know.
just that little love thing, like, oh my gosh, the sweetest thing.
She
That's so
cannot be
cute.
resisted. We live in Minnesota and it's March in Minnesota. It's been a long winter and this guy
Hmm.
just comes up to us and he says like in this gruff old man voice, he's like, "She's the cutest thing I've seen all winter."
Oh, so cute.
Like it's a
You're
long
like, yep,
winter.
yep, sounds about right. Oh, I love that so much. She is cute. She's so cute.
She's
Even just in
so
her
cute.
picture, but I'm sure that her personality adds so much to that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. So, I know that with achondroplasia, there's a spectrum of physical issues or struggles. How has her like overall health been?
She is a very healthy girl.
Mm,
We are very lucky. We're monitoring her closely and looking for signs of things like compression of her spinal cord, and
mhm.
that can be a problem with achondroplasia. That's probably the biggest one. So far, we are in the clear on that.
Awesome.
And, her biggest thing has been ear tubes and adenoids out. And by my standards, that is basically not anything. It's
Mhm.
really, we've been just amazingly lucky. She's been a little delayed in milestones, which is typical, but yeah, she's pretty on track with development at this point.
Mm. And when you say like with your perspective, that's nothing. And I'm assuming you're thinking of your situation with your brother and growing up with his profound disabilities. Is that?
That is true. My brother has disabilities, and yeah, I talked to him yesterday. He preferred
Mhm.
that I called it different abilities or
Oh, okay.
limitations. So
Limitations.
I'm
Okay.
gonna try to go with that. Although that
Yes.
my natural word choice is usually disability.
Yeah, we'll go
But
with whatever he prefers.
I told him I would try to use
Okay.
those terms. So my brother had all kinds of hospitalizations and health problems, and actually, so he had a rare disease. Also, my mother had a rare form of cancer that she died of in
Mm,
2011. So I think I've been around hospitals
mm,
um, enough to know that we're very lucky with what
yeah.
Anna has been dealing with and what she has not been dealing with.
Yeah, that's so valid. Like that perspective, whereas, not to minimize what you've been through, but maybe if that had happened and you hadn't had the experience with your mom or your brother, it might have felt harder. But I imagine that having that perspective has been a really helpful thing.
It really has. I can really empathize with a lot of people's struggles just from what I
Mm,
have seen people go through. And that's, I guess, my fear when she was diagnosed when I was pregnant, was, all the things that I imagined that we would have to deal with.
mm,
And so it's been really eye-opening to me that, the major thing that we're dealing with is just stigma and
mhm,
society. And there's actually nothing really wrong with her from a
mm,
certain perspective.
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a great lead in to that 32-week ultrasound when you found out that there was anything different about her. So I would love for you to go back to that moment of realizing that or of being told that.
Sure. So, with my history and my family, ultrasounds were never something where I was like, yay, we get to see the baby and find out
Mm,
if it's a boy or girl. It was always, is everything okay? I would
mhm,
be in the waiting room just sort of doubled over with anxiety for every single ultrasound. It was for my son, who's now 4, and every ultrasound checked out okay. And then
mm,
for Anna, the 12 week was fine. The 20 week was actually fine. And I actually remember, if they were making a movie of my life, this would be a scene. But the
mm.
maternal fetal medicine doctor came in after the 20-week ultrasound and said, all the major anatomical structures are in place. Now all she has to do is grow. And I was like, oh,
Mm,
okay, that should be no problem. Like, we have big babies in my family. And I
mhm,
thought, all right, well, maybe we're gonna, get through this. And they had me come back at 32 weeks just because I was advanced maternal age. I had just
mm,
turned 40 when I was pregnant with her. So we went into the midwife's office instead of maternal fetal medicine because it was just supposed to be like a biophysical profile kind of thing.
Mm.
And so I remember this vividly that it was a new ultrasound tech. So we had always seen this other woman, but um, that time we had a younger woman, and she started out with a head, and she looked at the head and she's like, everything in the head looks fine. And I was like, all right, that's
Mm.
huge because a lot of my
Mhm.
brother's stuff is neurological and he has hydrocephalus, and that was always on my radar big time. And
Mhm.
the head looks fine. All right, so the head looks fine. And then her heart was looking fine. Her torso, you know how they look at the breathing motions of their diaphragm or like their
Right.
hiccuping and things like that. That checked out and she was moving. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like all these things are checking out. And then she's like, all right, I just have to get a measure of her femur. I had almost stopped paying attention at that point because I figured, this is basically over. And she's
Yeah.
like, I think she's just turned funny, and she kept trying to get me to shift, and she's like, I just can't get a measurement on her femur. And she's like, I'm going to call in the other ultrasound tech. And that was a woman that we had many times before. And she's a little bit on the brusque side. Like she doesn't like, I think because her job is like dealing with people who are, wanting to ask her questions and she's not wanting to answer, because she's an
Mm.
ultrasound tech. So she
Right.
doesn't invite any questions. And she took one measurement of one side of the femur, one measurement of the other side of the femur. It was like click, click. And then she's like, okay. And she just walked out. And
Oh, man.
and so I went into the midwife and, what's going on? And she said, well, I'm sure it's just some kind of error, like, but we're going to send you to maternal fetal medicine just to check everything out. And I said, well, what could it be? And she said, well, Down syndrome. And I'm like, well, we had like a 12-week blood test for Down syndrome and it
Oh.
came back okay. And she's like, well, then, and who knows, basically. And so we went to maternal fetal medicine. And that's where I had never hoped to go back to because I always know we wanted to have
Mm.
2 kids, and this was my 2nd child, and I was at 32 weeks, and I was almost across the finish line, and
Mhm.
I hate maternal fetal medicine. I mean, they do great things, but
Yeah.
it's so stressful, and
Yeah.
so we wind up back in MFM, and they just did so much looking. They looked at everything.
Mm.
I think our appointment started at, like, 9, and it was, like, nearly 11 by the time they were finished.
Wow.
Scanning, and they're not telling me anything, but I can like read the numbers, and it says the percentile for the bones. And so
Mm.
it's less than second percentile for her arm bones, her upper arm bones, and her upper leg bones. And so I know something is wrong, and
Right.
we come out, and then they're like, can you go back in? They want to take more images of her head. Like,
What?
oh my God, I'm just like, just tell me. Like, I
Yeah.
need to know this is my own like purgatory that I'm in.
Yeah.
So we went back, did more ultrasounds, and then we went into the room. And my husband, who has a great sense of humor, always calls this the room with the tissues because it's a room with a table, and on that table is a box of tissues. And there's like basically nothing else in
Yeah.
this room. And you're like, if you've been in the room with the tissues, like
Yes.
you know what that is about. That
Oh,
is
we've
like
been in the room with the tissues too. I totally
that's
know what you're talking about.
like they put the big box of tissues there because they know that you're gonna be crying.
Very ominous.
It's so terrible. And then they
Yeah.
make you wait. And I mean, by the time that the woman came in, who's the MFM doctor, I was just ready to know.
Mm.
I couldn't live in this uncertainty. And I still also remember she came in and she said, oh, your name is Catherine. Do you go by Catherine? And I'm like, yes, like, okay, move on. And she's like, oh, my name is Catherine too. And I just looked at her like, I don't care what your name is. Like, just tell me what's wrong
Tell
with my
me.
baby. Like, this is not the time for like idle chit chat about like
Yeah.
who cares what your name is? Who cares what my name is? Like, what's wrong with my baby? And in retrospect, she was trying hard to tell me things that I couldn't hear or process in the way that
Mm.
she was trying to tell them to me. at that time,
Mm.
because she was talking about skeletal dysplasia, and I was basically like, "So what you're saying is that she's just short?" And she was like, "Well, we can't really be sure. There's like 200 different types of skeletal dysplasia." And I'm like, "Okay, but what it is probably she's just short, right?" Like
Mm.
I kept trying to get her to say, like,
Mhm.
but probably she's just short. And like at one point she just like looked me in the eyes and she was like, she could be, but the likelihood is that she has skeletal dysplasia, and the likelihood is that it's achondroplasia.
Mm.
And I was like, all right, I hear what you're saying, but that just doesn't make sense to me right now.
Mm.
Um, and if I had been able to actually listen to what she was saying, you know, she was actually kind underneath of it all. I mean, I shouldn't say underneath because delivering a diagnosis is not inherently unkind. But
Right.
she talked about a friend of hers who had a child with osteogenesis imperfecta, or OI, which is
Mm.
another kind of dwarfism, and about that child's capabilities and how most kids with achondroplasia do quite well. So
Mm.
she was trying to tell me things that were gentle, but the main thing that she was trying to tell me was something that I just couldn't hear, you
Mm.
know? And so I think when we left there, we were just in complete shock. My husband was with me, and he didn't say much. Like, he's a pretty
Mm.
stoic person, but like we're on the highway heading home, and we're on the right lane, and he just starts drifting onto the shoulder.
Oh.
He's just like on the rumble strip. And I'm like, oh my God, like we're literally running off the road. And he's like, oh yeah, okay. So um, you know, it was that shocking. It's not
Right.
something that either of us had ever had any experience with. I
Yeah.
don't think I had ever met anyone with achondroplasia
Mhm.
until I met my daughter. Um,
Yeah. I think it's a powerful statement that so many people can relate with. It's like, I hadn't even met anyone with fill in the blank until I met my child. Like, that is so powerful and I think so relatable, which is so scary, right? Because, like, how are you supposed to raise a child with this when you've never even met anyone with it?
that was my headspace, was
Yeah.
that it was a binary, that either she was going to be fine and everything was fine and they were just totally wrong, or this was something that I absolutely could not deal with.
Hmm.
Um, and that was a really hard place to exist for the last 5 weeks of my pregnancy.
Yeah. Yeah. Where did your mind go when you went into that? Like, I imagine that it bounced back and forth. Like, maybe she's just fine. And then, like, oh no, she's not fine. When you were going into like the not fine, what were your thought processes like?
I really spiraled. I mean, I really went to a place with that where um, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think that I could be a good mom to her. Um,
Mm.
Actually, I did a lot of reading, of course, as one does when you have 5 weeks to just stew on something. And
Mhm.
I read about some study somewhere that said that children of average height parents have lower self-esteem than children of parents that have achondroplasia. Um, and I remember I went to my husband and I was like, we probably should give her up for adoption because I'm not going to be a good mom to her. Like, I'm not going to
Mm.
be able to accept this. Like, she needs someone who's going to be like really her cheerleader about this. And I'm not sure that
Mhm.
I can. And
Mm.
if I'm not okay with this, how am I going to raise her to be okay with this? I don't know if I can be a good mom.
Yeah.
And maybe she should be raised by people with achondroplasia. And
Mm.
he just looked at me and he's like, that's not cool. So he like resorted to like seventh grade language. Like, that's not cool. And I was like, but I think she'd be better off. And he's like,
Mm.
well, tough. She's stuck with this just the way Sam is. And I was like, that's
Mm.
the perfect answer. And he was right. We may not be the perfect parents, but we absolutely are her parents. Um,
Yes.
and so, I mean, that's where I was. I'm not
Mm,
proud of that, but I was just devastated.
yeah. Yeah, and I think, it's just it's hard to have the perspective, even if people are like, "Oh, look at this friend of mine who has a child with this and they're thriving," and, things like that. I think it's just hard to picture, um your own child still thriving or you even thriving as a parent. Where now I feel like, I think we both could say, like, man, I wish I could have shown myself then what life would be like now. Like, look at this beautiful child that I just adore. And not that we don't love them when we find out or when we're pregnant or, whenever that happens, but I think it's just hard to have that perspective. I almost feel like it's hard to connect a diagnosis with a child that you love so much. And not that like the diagnosis would make you not love them, but for me at least, it was like, oh, he's going to have all these crazy hard things that he's going to face and that we're going to face. Oh, but he'll also be a child that is, like Wendy, like we'll love him just as much. Like it was almost hard to like put those two worlds together.
And when you're pregnant, it's you haven't met your child, and I think about that sometimes, like, would I rather have gotten the diagnosis after she was born? And I think in the end, I'm glad that I had that time with it, because then when she was born, I didn't have that sort of simultaneous, postpartum being with a newborn thing, which is complicated in and of
Mhm.
itself, plus the
Yeah.
diagnosis. Like, I got to have my freak out. Um, and then when she was born, it was a real turning point for me in a good way. And
Interesting.
I got to be able to move through it. But,
Mm.
not knowing your child, and she didn't even have a name yet, and she had a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the headspace that I was in. And I should say, to kind of continue off the story, that they told me that they needed to induce me at 37 weeks. And so my husband was a little bit more upset about that. He kind of was enjoying the time to think about it, whereas I
Mhm.
was like, it is summer, I am hot, I am uncomfortable, I am in a state of mental and emotional duress. Like, I need to
Mm.
have this baby. And so
Yes.
I wasn't upset about that.
Yeah, and probably, like, I don't know if you had this kind of, like, feeling of, like, "Okay, like, we're waiting to find out what it really is gonna be like, and, like, let's just do it," like, instead of just that
Yes.
painful waiting time.
I knew that I was in a bad headspace and that I needed something to change.
Mhm.
Even as scared as I was of her birth and what it was going to be like. I knew that where I was not a good place. Um,
Mhm.
so we went in for the induction, and that was the beginning of Anna like surprising me by how easy she was.
Mm.
And she was born, and it was very easy. They had to like stop
Mm.
me because they wanted to go get the NICU team. They're like, all right, hold on a minute, we got to get the NICU.
Oh, wow.
She
Wow.
was coming.
Yeah.
And then, they whisked her away right away. I mean, I think they were going to do that anyway, no matter what, because of the
Mm.
ultrasounds. And I don't know, I had thought that maybe I would get to hold her, and they put her on my chest for like 1 nanosecond, and then they took her. Um,
Mm.
so that was hard.
Yeah.
Randy went with her, and I stayed, and they were kind of working on me. And then Randy came back, and he just said, she's very beautiful.
Mm.
And that was a really sweet moment for
Mm.
me. But I didn't get to hold her even at all that evening, because they
Mm.
told me that she had had like too much of an eventful day and she needed to rest. And
Oh.
looking back on that, I feel like that was like our lost night,
Mm.
because at the time I was kind of like, I was a little out of it, and I was like, all right, I'll sleep, like that's,
Mhm.
being a mom, a second time mom, you're like, okay, I'll sleep.
Yeah, get
You
it while
know
you
that
can.
like you can't, you got to do what you got to do and you can do it. And
Yeah.
so, but then by the time I woke up, and I was pretty rested, Randy was just like, you need to go and hold her. And, when he said that, I was like, I think you're right. And I went down there in the NICU, and, I just kind of sat down in the chair, and then I did not get up. I was like in that chair, for the entirety of her NICU stay with her on me
Mm,
when I wasn't, you know, sleeping or, like eating or going to the bathroom. That was like
mm,
where I was. And
mm.
I think I'm like in the vast minority of people that would say that overall, I think the NICU was a good experience for me. I know
Oh,
that's like
wow.
really weird. Um, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that I had a 2-year-old at home, and the NICU created a space that was for me and Anna, and
Yeah.
everybody else was dealing with everything else, and I could just do Anna. And
Mm.
and I also think that had a lot to do with the fact that she wasn't very sick, and also that I am very comfortable in hospitals because of my family history. And I guess then the other NICU nugget I would say, um, I would guess I was like 1 or 2 days postpartum, and they brought me into the room where they would do rounds because they didn't do rounds at the bedside because it was too disruptive. So they had like a room where all the doctors, all the residents,
Mm.
it was a teaching hospital, and there were probably like 20 people in the room, and they brought me in, and I'm like wearing like maternity sweatpants and like socks and Birkenstocks and like a hospital gown. Okay, so I'm like, I am ragged, and they're like, so, what did maternal fetal medicine say? And I gathered that they really had no idea what to do, and that they
Mm.
didn't see this very often, and that they were kind of asking me possibly for like, well, what did the other doctors say that we should
Oh, man. Like, that's not what you wanna hear.
I was like, "Well," and this is where I put on my, like, professor voice, and I was like, "Well, Doctor so and so at maternal fetal medicine said you should do an X-ray, which is a skeletal survey, that we need a geneticist to lay eyes on her, and then you should do a blood draw and do genetic testing for achondroplasia and hypochondroplasia." And then I just remember, like, one of the residents, like, looking up from her notepad at me, like, "What planet did you, like, drop down from?" 'Cause I'm like, I'm very calm, I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm in control of this room right now. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you in a very logical way, and
Mhm.
I don't know, it made me feel very self-possessed, even though I was to look at me, you would not have thought that I would be, like, handling the situation, but I'm like, "Actually, here's things that you should do," and they're like, "Okay." And then they
Yeah.
they did all those things. So I don't know, that was like the beginning of me
Mm.
starting to feel like maybe I got this, maybe,
Yeah.
what she's going through, again, by my standards, is really just not that bad. I didn't ever think that she was sick,
Right.
really, really sick.
So I'm curious, how do you feel like that kind of shaped the rest of her life as her mother? Like, is your perception of yourself, where you say, like, that feeling of, maybe I've got this. Do you feel like that was a precursor to the rest of her life and you in a good place emotionally for that?
Well, that was the first thing I did. And then after that, medically, I really sort of took the reins. So, that was just the first of several things I think that
Mm.
are along those lines of things that I did that really empowered me.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I would say her initial geneticist diagnosis was incorrect. So they thought she had hypochondroplasia. And so we were waiting on the blood test for about 3 months. And then it came back that it actually was achondroplasia. And in that second meeting with that same geneticist that we'd seen in the hospital, my husband and I both just came away like, this guy is awful. He's
Oh.
pompous, he's patronizing us, he's like flirting with the resident. So he's like, all right, come back in a year. And I'm like, a year? Like, a lot happens in a year. I have a
Yeah.
3-month old, and I don't accept that. I think that all the stuff that I'm reading and looking at says if they're going to present with compression of the spinal cord, that can easily happen and does tend to happen early on. And our pediatrician didn't really know what to do. She was trying, but nobody knew whether she should have a CT scan or an MRI. And then our pediatrician ordered an ultrasound, which they could do through her fontanelles, which hadn't closed. Um,
Mm.
So I'm like, nobody knows, what they're doing. And so
Oh, man.
she was 4 months, and I actually remember the moment when this like occurred to me, which was that, I'm from Baltimore. My brother was treated at Johns Hopkins his whole life, and they have really great doctors there. And so I called the skeletal dysplasia clinic at Johns Hopkins and I said, I have a 4-month-old daughter who just got diagnosed with achondroplasia. And I didn't know it at the time, but the woman that answered my call and was scheduling actually has achondroplasia, and she's one of their skeletal dysplasia.
What?
She's one of their like people in their clinic
That's
that
so
works with
cool.
parents. Oh my God. So she's like, all right, for the geneticist there, it was amazing. She'll fit you in next week. I'm
Wow.
like, so I'm on kayak.com. I'm like, I'm booking a flight. We're going. And
Wow.
it was like around Thanksgiving, and we stayed with my dad because I'm from Baltimore, and he was happy to have us, and it was a super easy, direct 3-hour flight. And I will acknowledge that there's a lot of privilege in just being able to do that financially, and not to mention having health insurance that covers it. Um,
Mm,
but I just would totally advocate, if you're at all unsure about your doctors, to expand your geographical search. And for
mm.
me, it was easier because, I had a lot of comfort with Hopkins. That's basically where my family goes. So, I went there and they looked at her. I met with their whole team. Well, not their whole team, but I met with the geneticist, the neurologist. They knew that you should do an MRI and not a CT scan, and
Mm.
they knew what the measurements should be. And in someone with achondroplasia, which is different than someone without achondroplasia, and so
Yeah.
they were measuring off the right graphs, and um,
Wow, that's
they knew what they were looking
awesome.
at. It was amazing.
Yay.
And so
Competent doctors.
and I was
Yay.
like, "This is where I belong."
Yeah.
So, we even before we got in to see the geneticist, the physician's assistant, and the woman who has achondroplasia, and she's, a really great advocate. She's a member of LPA, which is the Little People of
Mm.
America, and they looked at Anna and they're like, "Her head's not that big." And I'm like, "Oh my God, like everyone, you're the first I had to come to
Mm.
Baltimore so that I could hear that her head's not that big."
Like, that's worth it.
It's worth the whole trip right there. And they were just like, "Yeah, like this is okay," and
Mm.
the woman who had achondroplasia, and this is something I will never forget. Before I met with the geneticist, just while we were waiting, was me and Anna and her in the room, and she told me, I have achon, which is like I have a husband that's achon. I have 4 children who all have achondroplasia. Ask me anything.
Wow. That's
And I
so
was
awesome.
Oh my God. And so then you're like, well, I have a lot of a lot of things I want to ask.
Yeah.
Like, what do I even ask? And so without even thinking, the question that I came up with was, how do I raise her with the confidence to go through life with this? Because
Mm.
I don't have that much confidence. I told her, I'm at like 85%. She laughed. I was like, so I really feel like that was the crux of my issue, was like, I'm not in myself that confident that I feel like I could go around with achondroplasia. Um,
Mm.
and how do I teach my child to have that sense of herself? And her answer, which I absolutely love, she said, "Well, you have to fake it."
Oh.
It's like she's like, "You know how you fake things with kids? Like, like you teach them how to ride a bike and you let go and you're like, 'You got this,' and you're like, 'I hope they got this,' you know?"
Yeah.
She's like, "You fake it, just like you fake it with all your children." And I'm like, "Oh."
That's the secret to the universe.
That makes so much sense. Like, I don't have to be operating at 100% confidence or 100% perfection. Like, I can fake it.
Mm.
And that was the appointment where I started to believe that maybe I got this and maybe we're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And just this team of doctors was just so powerful to have. It's a skeletal dysplasia clinic, so they have everyone in the same clinic working on the kids, and they all have pieces of the knowledge and they all share them. And um,
Mm.
I don't know, I just felt like we had landed in some sort of safety net. And we went up to see the neurosurgeon too, and I told her, my brother has hydrocephalus, he has a shunt, and I've heard that's something that people with achondroplasia can have to have. And so I know about
Mm,
shunts. I know a lot about shunts, and they're not easy sometimes, and they require like a
mhm,
lot of revisions and a lot of surgeries. And as you get older, you get some scar tissue and some sort of hardening of whatever it is.
mhm,
So I wasn't excited about a shunt. And she basically told me, first of all, you can have a decompression surgery, and the likelihood, the extreme likelihood, is that you won't need a shunt. Not that some people
mm.
don't, but. And she just looked at me and said, what Anna has is not the same etiology as what your brother has. And I was like, "Oh, my therapist told me that too."
Yeah.
I'm like getting into that territory, but
Yeah.
but I needed to hear it from the neurosurgeon, like the neurosurgeon in the same department where he had his neurosurgery as a child. It
Yeah.
almost felt like I was coming home to to hear I finally started to hear what the doctors are saying, where I feel like,
Mm.
where in my 32-week ultrasound, like they were talking and I wasn't hearing. And now it's like I started coming into focus with doctors, and like, okay,
Mm.
this is what we're dealing with. I'm ready to engage. I'm ready to talk about this.
Really love that. That's so cool.
Mhm.
Well, I would love to wrap up with I know you've kind of alluded to this, but kind of in hindsight of like, this is what my daughter has given me, or things that you
Mhm.
have gained because of her.
Oh my gosh. Well, I started to heal, and heal in like a really big, slow way. I think that
Mm,
when I actually spent that time holding her in the NICU and when we came home, and I feel like I was kind of holding on to her for dear life. Like I was soothing her, but she was also soothing me, and just
mm,
being with her whenever I would get, upset or fearful about the future. I had this wonderful, warm, baby smelling baby that was right cuddled up on me, and like how wonderful that was. And I feel like
mm,
if you're going to cling to someone, a newborn is a great choice because they just cling to you right back. Like they don't
mhm.
need space, right? They're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I want to be with you too. Even Anna, she'll say
Mhm.
that sometimes. She'll like, be with mommy, be
Oh,
with mom, you
oh.
know, and it's like she has been such a healing power to me, and in such a physical way, like
Mm,
she's my baby, and I love her so much. And that has nothing to do with anything about her diagnosis or about stigma or the world or the doctors or anything. And to realize that I am, in fact, very capable of feeling that toward her and being her mom, I definitely have a feeling that it is both okay and not okay. Like I
mm,
have a lot of feelings of like wounds from, even from just being a kid and dealing with a lot of things that, we can talk about, but different difficult
mm,
medical situations and this grief process and all of that wrapped up. And there's just this big, like, this is not okay. There's a lot of stuff for me.
mm,
But then on the other hand, she's so wonderful. She's exactly who she is and who she's meant to be.
mm.
And my thing, the work that is in my path in my life right now, is to grow to be worthy of being the mom to a child of such perfection.
I love that so much. Wow. That really resonates with me.
So there's a poem, that a line from which always stuck with me. And I wanted to read this couple lines just for whoever is listening to this podcast who needs to hear this poem, because it's something that I thought of a lot when I was, in that newborn stage where I was just holding Anna
Mm,
all the time. And this is a poem by Mary Oliver. It's called Wild Geese. It says, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves.
Wow. That is beautiful.
That is parenting of kids with a special need. Like, you feel like you
Mm,
have to walk for 100 miles through the desert repenting, but you just have to love them, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah, totally. Ugh, that is really powerful. And it's easy to forget that. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing about Anna and your adventures with her and kind of your evolution. You can find adorable photos of Anna and her family on the website, therarelifepodcast.com. If you feel like you need help navigating the fear and grief that often comes with having a child with medical complexities, I encourage you to check out the online service BetterHelp. You'll be matched with a licensed therapist that works with you via video calls, phone calls, or even messaging if that is what you want. They are also more affordable than traditional counseling. If that speaks to you, follow my affiliate link in the show notes to get a discount and to support this podcast. Also in the show notes, I have links to episodes 6 and 7 with Emily Young, who shared about her daughter Nora, who also has achondroplasia. So if you want to hear more about that, check those out. Join us next week for Katherine's special topic episode as she shares her perspective and advice from being Jonathan's sister. Don't miss it. See you then.